A cowboy earns respect. A cowgirl commands it without saying a word. The deed was in my left breast pocket when I rode onto the Creole Range that morning. I'd folded it 4 times so it fit clean. Kept touching it through my coat, the way a man checks for a wound he isn't sure is there yet. The grass was still winter gray, just the edge of green trying to come up through it. Middle of March, that year, 1884, or close enough. Mule Creek country between the breaks and the benchland above the river, where the wind comes off the water and strips the warmth right off you before you've had time to appreciate you ever had any. I'd ridden up from Billings in 4 days with 2 horses and a canvas roll, and a letter from a lawyer I'd never met, telling me I owned 240 acres and a house that needed a new roof. The house needed more than a new roof. I saw that from 300 yards out. One wall of the barn had come down, the east wall, and the boards were stacked against what remained of it, like somebody had tried to start a repair and then quit or been made to quit. There was a wagon in the yard with a broken wheel, a pump that looked like it hadn't moved since August. 2 horses in the corral, though, good ones. That surprised me. You don't leave good horses in a broken place unless you're coming back to it or unless you never left. I stopped my animals at the gate and waited. You do that? A man rides onto unknown land, and he stops at the gate and he waits, because the land isn't unknown to everyone. She came out of the house with a rifle. Not pointed at me, just carried. The way a woman carries a rifle when she's been alone long enough that it doesn't feel like a threat anymore, just an extension of her arm, like a walking stick. She was maybe 30, 32. Dark hair pulled back. She wore a man's coat, heavy canvas, open at the collar despite the cold. She stood on the porch and looked at me. That was all, just looked. I said, "My name is Callum Preach. I have a deed to this property." She said, "I know who you are." I didn't know how that was possible, but she said it like a fact, the way you say the sun came up this morning or the river runs east from here. No heat in it, no fear. "Then you know I'm not here to cause trouble," I said. "Whether you cause trouble," she said, "isn't something I know yet." She went back inside. She left the door open. I've thought about that open door 1,000 times since. It wasn't an invitation, exactly. It wasn't a warning either. It was just, she left the door open, and that meant what it meant, and I could take it or ride on. I tied my horses to the gate post and walked up to the porch and went inside. My father had won that land in a card game in 1871, and never once set foot on it. That was the kind of man he was. He collected things he didn't use. When he died the winter before, the lawyer in Billings found me working a line camp up on the mussel shell and told me about the deed. My father had kept it in a tin box. The tin box was the most valuable thing I'd found in his house, and the deed was the most valuable thing in the box, which tells you something about how he lived. I was 41 years old, and I had spent the last 20 years of my life working other men's land. I was good at it. I was the kind of man other men brought in when something needed doing that required patience and a level head, breaking horses that had broken other men, tracking stock into the breaks, riding fence in conditions that kept reasonable men indoors. I wasn't rough exactly. I wasn't a fighter, or not primarily. I was just competent, quietly, unfussily competent in a way that people used without particularly noticing, the way you use a good tool. I had never owned anything I could stand on and feel under my feet. Her name was Nora Creel. The property had been her father's before it was my father's neighbor's, before it passed around through debt and drink and death the way land does out there. She had been living on it for 3 years alone, holding it together the best she could. Her father had died. Her husband, she'd had one briefly, had gone north and not come back, and whether that was death or desertion she didn't say, and I didn't ask for a long while. She had kept the horses because the horses were worth keeping. She had let the barn wall go because there was only one of her, and the wall would take 3 men and a week. She had maintained the house, the pump, the garden plot behind the south wall that was bare now but had been, she told me without particular pride, the only reason she'd had vegetables for the last 2 winters. She told me all of this at the kitchen table, not defensively, just as fact laid out straight the way you'd lay tools out before a job. Here is what is here, and here is its condition, and here is what it costs to keep it this way. She poured coffee without asking if I wanted it. It was good coffee. That told me something too. I told her I didn't intend to put her off the land. She looked at me then, really looked, the way she hadn't quite done since the porch, and she said, "I didn't ask you your intentions." "No," I said, "you didn't." "I'd have stayed either way," she said. I want you to know that, whatever you decide. It wasn't a threat and it wasn't a plea. It was just the truth of her. She'd stay because the land was worth staying on and because she'd already decided she wouldn't be moved, and my arrival was a fact she intended to incorporate, not a crisis she needed to manage. I thought, I have never met a woman like this. And then I thought, that might be because I've been riding line camps for 20 years and haven't met many people of any kind, so perhaps reserve judgment. But I knew, sitting at that table with coffee I hadn't asked for, that I was already adjusting my plans. I'd intended to sell it. That was the honest truth. I'd ridden up there to see what I had and then ride back to Billings and find a buyer. Land in Mule Creek was worth something, not a fortune, but enough to set me up somewhere with a small stake. I was 41 and had nothing, and 240 acres I'd never seen felt like luck I hadn't earned and probably shouldn't trust. But I walked the property that first afternoon, and I changed my mind. Not because of the land. Well, because of the land, but that's not all of it. The land was good. The creek ran clear. There was timber on the north slope, and the grass in the lower meadow had the thick root structure of ground that hadn't been overgrazed. But I'd seen good land before and not felt anything particular. What I felt walking that land was that somebody had been caring for it carefully for a long time with not enough help, and not enough money, and not enough acknowledgement from anyone. The fence line was maintained. The water rights markers were clear and recent. The grave, her father's, I learned later up on the east ridge under a juniper, had a stone that was solid set, not just laid. These were the marks of a person who understood that a thing worth having is worth the work of having it, even when no one is watching. I came back to the house at dusk, and she had food on the table. Not elaborate, beans and salt pork and cornbread, but there were 2 plates. I sat down and didn't say anything about the land yet, and she didn't ask. After supper, I said I'd sleep in the barn. She said the barn had a hole in it. I said I'd slept in worse. She looked at me for a moment, and I had the feeling again that she was simply taking me in, filing me accurately, not deciding yet but not uncertain either. Just looking. And then she nodded once and cleared the plates. I lay in the barn that night on my bedroll, listening to the horses shift and breathe, and I thought about how long it had been since I'd sat at a table with another person and eaten a meal that was cooked for 2. I stayed. I didn't announce it as a decision. I just didn't leave the next morning, and then I didn't leave the morning after that, and by the end of the first week, we had both accepted without saying so that I wasn't leaving. The first thing I fixed was the barn wall. Not because I announced I was going to, I just started pulling boards up at daybreak on the second morning, and by midday she came out and held pieces while I nailed, not because I asked her to, but because she saw what was needed and did it. That was how it went, those first weeks. Neither of us narrating, just working alongside, and when something needed a second set of hands, one of us showed up and did it. There was a man in the nearest town, a place called Burdett, 8 miles east along the river road named Holly's Fen. He ran a cattle operation on the North Range, and he had been, I gathered, making offers on Nora's land for 2 years. Not unfair offers, just persistent ones. The kind that come with the implication that sooner or later you'll see reason. I heard about him first from the man at the feed store in Burdett, who mentioned him the way you mention weather, as a fact of the landscape, unavoidable. I heard about him second from Nora herself, matter-of-factly, the way she told me everything without heat. He wants the creek frontage, she said, and the south meadow. What did you tell him? That it wasn't for sale. And he said everything's for sale. She was sharpening a knife while she talked, drawing it across the whetstone in long, even strokes. She didn't look up. When's he come next? I asked. When he feels like it, she said. He doesn't announce himself. I let that sit a moment, then I said, he'll announce himself now. She stopped sharpening, looked up at me. I said, or he won't come at all. Either one works. She held my eyes for a moment. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. She went back to the knife. I went and tightened the gate latch and moved the horses to the nearer corral where they'd be visible from the road. Small things. The kind of things you do when you want a place to look occupied and intentional, not struggling. Fen came 3 days later on a Thursday on a good horse, with a man behind him I didn't know. I was on the roof when he rode in. I'd been up there since early morning working the shingles. I watched him come down the road, stop at the gate, look at the mended barn wall and the newly hung gate and the horses in the front corral. I watched him take it in. I kept working. I did not come down off the roof. He called out a hello. I called back one, kept working. He said he was looking for Miss Creel. I said she was in the house, and he was welcome to knock. There was a pause. He looked at the roof. He looked at his man. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Callum Preach. I own the land you're standing on." Another pause, longer. He said, "That deed's disputed." I said, "It isn't," kept working, pulled a nail, said it, drove it. "The lawyer in Billings can tell you the same. Name's Whitford. You're welcome to the ride." He stayed at the gate for a long moment. Then he touched his hat, not to me, I don't think, just a reflex, and he turned his horse and rode out. His man followed him. I came down off the roof an hour later when the work was done. Nora was on the porch. She had 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one without saying anything. I drank it standing next to her, looking out at the empty road. She said, "He'll be back." I said, "Probably." "You don't seem worried about it." "I'm not worried about it." She looked at me sidelong. "Why not?" I thought about it. I said, "Because a man who has to show up with another man to talk to a woman who's alone isn't a man with a strong hand. He's a man who knows his hand is weak and compensates. He'll bluster. He won't do much." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what I thought too." I looked at her. "I just wanted to see if you'd say it," she said. She went inside with her coffee. April came in cold and wet, which up there meant the creek ran high and the lower meadow went soft, and we lost a week of work waiting for it to firm enough to disc. I used the time on the equipment. The plow needed a new handle. The harness needed resewing in 4 places. The wagon wheel I'd replaced in March had developed a wobble I didn't like. Nora worked indoors, which that time of year meant canning the last of the root cellar stock and taking inventory for the spring order. She kept a ledger, careful, fine-columned writing. I saw it on the table one evening and looked closer than I probably should have, and I said, "You've been running this closer than I thought." She looked up from where she was sewing. "Running what closer?" "The money." She didn't answer for a moment, then she said, "Yes." "How close?" "Close enough that another winter alone might have been the one that ended it." She said it plainly, without self-pity or performance, just fact. I looked at the ledger for another moment. Then I closed it and put it back where I'd found it and didn't bring it up again that night. But I thought about it. I had $200 in a money belt. I'd been saving it for a stake somewhere, someday. I thought about what it would buy in terms of time, seed, and calves, and the feed to carry those calves through a hard winter. I thought about the barn wall I'd already fixed, and the shingles and the gate and the harness. I thought about 240 acres with a good creek and south-facing meadow and timber on the north slope, and a root cellar that had kept a woman alive through 3 winters. I went to bed and lay awake longer than usual, and in the morning I told Nora I wanted to talk about the spring plan. She sat across the table from me and listened. I told her what I had and what I thought it should go toward, and what I thought the land could do by fall if we worked it right. I wasn't asking permission exactly. It was my deed and my money, but I wasn't declaring either. I was talking to her because she'd been on this land 3 years and knew it better than I did, and her judgment was worth having. She listened to the whole thing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The South Meadow wants to run cattle, not crops. The soil's too thin for grain and the slope drains wrong." I said I had the same thought. "What kind of cattle?" She said, "I've been thinking Herefords. There's a man in Miles City selling stock this spring." I said, "How far is Miles City?" 2 days' ride." "When does he sell?" "Month's end." I said, "Then we've got a month to get the corral fencing up to hold them." She looked at me then with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between assessment and something else, something she was deciding whether to let reach her face. Then she said, "All right." That was how we became partners, more or less, without saying it, without a handshake or a contract, just a month's end deadline and a corral that needed its fencing squared away. Burdett was 8 miles, but it might as well have been a different country, the way it thought about things. The people there had watched the Creel place fall apart for 3 years, watched Nora hold it together with no help and not much acknowledgement. and had arrived at a quiet consensus that it was only a matter of time before she sold to Fen or let it go for taxes. Now there was a man on the land with a deed, and that changed the arithmetic for them in ways that Nora alone hadn't. That's the ugly truth of it, and I'm not going to dress it up. A woman holding on a loan was a curiosity, maybe an object of pity, maybe just a stubborn fact they'd wait out. A man with a deed was a neighbor, an entity the town's calculations had to account for. I went to Burdett twice in April, once for wire and once for seed, and both times men spoke to me who hadn't spoken to Nora in the 3 years she'd been there. Not impolite, just the kind of talking men do to establish where you stand and what you've got. I did it back. Answered what was being asked without saying more than I had to, which is generally the right approach with men who are making up their minds about you. There was a man named Aldous Trace who ran the feed store and who had, I gathered, watched Fen operate in the valley for a decade, and liked what he saw about as much as you'd like a burr in your boot. He told me about 3 other properties Fen had acquired in the last 5 years, 2 of them from widows and 1 from a man who'd borrowed against his land, and then had trouble repaying when his cattle died in the winter of '82. I listened, didn't offer opinion. When he was done, I said, "Appreciate you telling me that." He looked at me for a moment and said, "Nora Creel is good people." I said, "I know it." He nodded, something settled between us. He gave me a better price on the wire than he'd quoted at the door. That's how a reputation starts, not in proclamations, in small transactions done straight that add up to something a community can weigh. Fen came back in May, this time alone. He rode in on a Wednesday morning when I was working the lower fence and Nora was in the garden. I saw him coming from 200 yards and I kept working. I watched him stop at the gate, look around, see me. He came along the fence line to where I was. He was a big man, red-faced, prosperous-looking. Not physically intimidating exactly, but the kind of man who'd been told yes often enough that no caught him by surprise every time. He had a way of carrying himself that suggested he expected the world to arrange itself around him, and usually it had. He said, "Nice to see the place getting attention." I said, "It's good land." "Your deed's going to be challenged," he said. "I've had a lawyer look at the chain of title, and there are questions." I straightened up from the fence and looked at him. "What lawyer?" "Harkins in Forsyth. Harkins charges by the hour and he'll tell you what you pay him to tell you. The deed came from my father to me, clear and recorded. Whitford in Billings handled it. You're welcome to the conversation." He looked at me for a moment, recalibrating. Then he said, "The woman, Creel, she's got no legal standing here, you understand that?" I set the fencing pliers down on the post. Deliberate, I looked at him straight. I said, "Her standing here isn't a legal question. It's mine. She's my partner in this operation, and she stays as long as either of us wants her to stay, which will be a long time. If that's what you came to talk about, we're done talking." Something moved through his face. He was used to men who were uncertain, men who were in trouble, men who needed something from him. I didn't need anything from him. That's an uncomfortable thing to run up against when you've built your life on being needed. He said, "You're making a mistake." I picked the pliers back up. "Might be, you're welcome to watch how it turns out." He sat on his horse for another moment, and then he turned and rode out. I went back to the fence. Nora came down from the garden an hour later. She'd been close enough to hear most of it, I suspected. She didn't say anything about Fen. She handed me a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, and said the south fence post by the creek was leaning and needed resetting. I said I'd get to it after dinner. She nodded and went back to the garden. The cattle came from Miles City in late May, 18 Herefords, 6 of them cows with good lines, the rest yearlings. The man who sold them to me had known the Creel land by reputation, not Nora's, her father's, from decades back, and he said the South Meadow would suit Herefords well. I told him I'd been told the same by the woman who'd worked it for 3 years, and he looked at me like that was an unusual thing to say, and I supposed maybe it was. We drove them back in 2 days, Nora and I, one of us on each flank. She handled cattle the way she handled everything, without fuss, without drama, with a kind of quiet authority that the animals responded to before she did anything obvious to deserve it. There were a few who wanted to test the edges of the drive, and she simply moved on them before they made the decision, anticipated the thing rather than reacting to it. I watched her work and thought, she's been doing this her whole life. Of course she has. This is her country. The first night of the drive, we camped along the creek, 12 miles from home, built a small fire and ate what we'd brought and watched the cattle settle. It was a clear night, cold still at elevation but clear, and the stars they were the way stars are out there in open country, the kind of thing you stop being able to describe after a while because description always falls short of the actual. We sat by the fire without talking much. Comfortable silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. She said after a while, "Why did you stay?" I looked at the fire. I thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and then I thought about the true answer, which was simpler. I said because the land was worth it. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not all of it," she said, not accusatory, just accurate. I looked over at her. She was watching the fire, not me. Her profile in the firelight was serious, and still and entirely her own. I said, "No, that's not all of it." She didn't push for the rest of it, and I didn't offer it. Not that night. We drove the cattle home the next day and put them in the south meadow, and they looked right there, moving against the new green grass under the long afternoon light, and I stood at the fence and watched them, and I thought, this is mine. This is something I own, and I am making it work. It was the first time I'd thought that clearly, without qualification. June, midsummer. The kind of days the country is made for long, light, warm, dry air, grass belly deep on the cattle. We worked through it, Nora and I, fell into the rhythms of the land the way you do when you stop thinking about the work and just do it. Mornings I was up first, had coffee made by the time she came out, and she took it without comment, and we'd look at the day and decide what it wanted from us. Evenings I did the evening chores and she cooked, not because we discussed division of labor, but because it fell out that way naturally and suited us both. I was careful those months not to presume. She was a woman who had managed her own life and her own land for years, and she had not asked me to take charge of anything, and I was not going to start acting as though I had authority I hadn't earned. What I had was a deed and a set of hands and a certain competence, and I used those things in service of the land and tried not to let it go to my head. There were moments when I wanted to say something, not about us exactly, not with words, but just to close some distance. But I waited, partly because I wasn't sure what I'd say, partly because she wasn't ready, partly because I'd been wrong about enough things in my life that I'd gotten cautious about the things I wasn't willing to be wrong about. Fenn sent a man in July, not Fenn himself, a man named Rister who worked for him, who came with paperwork he said was a legal challenge to the deed. I took the papers and read them at the table that evening and showed them to Nora. She read them carefully. Then she looked up. "His lawyer's trying to argue that my father's sale to your father's neighbor was invalid because my father was in debt to Fenn at the time of sale, and Fenn had first refusal." I said, "Does Fenn have a document saying that?" "He says he does." "Then we need Whitford." I rode to Billings the next week. 4 days out, 4 back, with 2 days with the lawyer in between. Whitford was a careful man, dry as old wood, who had practiced land law for 30 years and had seen every variety of claim and counterclaim the territory had produced. He read the challenge carefully, and then he told me what he thought in plain language. Fenn had a document, but the document was older than the sale in question, predated it by 6 years, and had been superseded by subsequent transactions that voided the first refusal clause. He said, "In my opinion, he knows this. This is a pressure tactic." I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Write back. Tell him you've consulted counsel and the deed stands and you'll see him in territorial court if he'd like." He paused. "Then do something that demonstrates permanence." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Plant something that takes 3 years to produce. Fix something you'd only fix if you plan to stay. Get yourself known in that county as a man who isn't going anywhere." He leaned back. "Fenn's whole play depends on you or the woman eventually giving up. He's patient. You need to be more patient." I rode back with that in my head, 8 days on the road. When I came back, Nora had dug a root cellar extension, a new room off the back of the existing one, timber-lined, deep enough to hold twice what the old one held. She'd done it while I was gone, alone, and the pile of excavated dirt behind the house was enormous, and she had clearly worked herself half into the ground doing it. I stood looking at the new cellar door for a long moment. I said, "You dug that yourself?" She said, "The ground was soft from the June rains." I said, "Nora." She looked at me. I said, "You could have waited." She said, I know, I didn't want to wait. I went down into the new room. It was perfectly made. Squared timbers, level floor, good depth. It was the work of someone who intended to fill it for years. I came back up and stood in front of her, and I said, the lawyer says to do something that demonstrates permanence. She held my gaze. I know what he means, she said. I said, so do I. We looked at each other in the morning light, and I thought, she dug this room while I was gone because she was doing her part. She was already demonstrating permanence. She'd been demonstrating it for 3 years before I arrived. I said, I'm going to plant an apple orchard on the south slope. She was quiet for a moment. An apple orchard in that country takes 3 to 5 years before it bears fruit, depending on the winter. It's the kind of thing you plant because you're not leaving. She said, I'll help you mark the rows. August, the orchard rows marked with stakes. The challenge from Fenn's lawyer answered, the letter sent, and then nothing from Fenn for weeks, which I'd learned to read as him recalculating rather than retreating. I planted fruit trees in late August. Nora knew where to order them from a man in Bismarck who propagated stock for this climate. We ordered 20 trees, apple, 2 varieties for pollination. The morning the trees arrived, on a wagon from the depot in Burdett, 3 men from the valley showed up to help plant them, unprompted. A man named Decker who ran cattle on the adjacent range, and his son, and the man who owned the Burdett feed store, Aldous Trace, who had apparently decided to make a day of it. We spent the day digging and planting and watering in, and at the end of the day Nora brought food out of the house. She'd been cooking while we worked. Nothing grand, just the kind of meal you make for people who have done something useful. And we ate at the table outside while the light went long and gold across the new trees. It was, I realized, the first time I'd sat at a table with neighbors. Trace, eating his second helping, said to no one in particular, Fenn's going to be irritated those trees got planted. Decker said, Fenn can go to hell. His son, maybe 19, looked surprised to hear his father say that. Decker looked at me. You're not the first man he's squeezed, you're just the first one who didn't squeeze back. I said I didn't need to squeeze, I just needed to keep working. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, that's right. Not like he was agreeing with a point, like he was arriving at a judgment he'd been building toward all day. I looked at Nora across the table. She was listening. She met my eyes, and there was something in hers that I'd been waiting to see for months, a kind of arrival, a settling. The look of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has decided to put it down. After the men left, we cleaned up in the last of the daylight, carrying dishes in from outside, not talking. When we came inside for the last time, I set the stack of plates on the counter and turned around, and she was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at me. She said, Callum. I said, yeah. She said, I want to say something. I waited. She said, I've been watching you since March. You came here with a deed to land you'd never seen, and you could have sold it, and you didn't. You fixed the barn and the gate and the roof, and you put money into the cattle, and you rode to Billings and back, and you planted 20 apple trees today that won't bear fruit for 5 years. She paused. And you did it all without, she stopped, started again. Without making me feel like I had to ask permission to be here, on land I've worked for 3 years. I said, it's your land too. Legally it isn't. Legally, no. She looked at me steadily. I want you to know that I see what you've done, not just the work, the way you've done it, and I want you to know I don't take it for nothing. I said, Nora. She waited. I said, I stayed because of the land, and I stayed because of you, and those 2 things aren't separate anymore. I don't think they were separate from very early on. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of me and put her hand flat against my chest. Just her palm, flat against my shirt over my heart, steady. She looked up at me. She said quietly, I know that. I put my hand over hers and held it there, and neither of us said anything for a long moment, standing in the kitchen with the dusk coming in the window and the smell of the evening coming in behind it. It was the most certain I had felt about anything in 20 years. September, October. The cattle went into the fall in good condition. The root cellar, both rooms, was full. I'd cut timber for a new barn addition, the lumber stacked and drying. There were 20 young apple trees on the south slope in their first autumn, and they'd taken all of them. Not one had died. Fenn didn't come back. I heard from Trace that he'd acquired a property north of Burdett that spring, got it for less than it was worth from a man who'd had a bad year, and that had likely redirected his attention. I wasn't naive about it. He might come back with a new angle or new paperwork or a new approach. But I'd stopped spending energy on him. A man who spends all his energy anticipating trouble that hasn't arrived is a man who isn't working, and there was always work. One evening in October, I was on the porch after supper, the cold coming in sharp off the river, and Nora came out and stood beside me. She had her coat on and her hair was down. She'd unpinned it inside, not thinking about outside, and hadn't pinned it back before coming out. I noticed that. Small things. We looked at the valley in the evening dark, the creek reflecting the last of the sky, the cattle in the south meadow just shapes in the dusk. She said, "Decker asked me today if we were married." I said, "What did you tell him?" I said, "Not yet." She paused. He seemed to think that was as good as yes. I looked at her. She was watching the valley, the side of her face in the last light. I said, "Is he wrong?" She turned and looked at me then, direct, the way she did everything. She said, "He's not wrong." I said, "All right then." She almost smiled. That's the most unromantic thing I've ever heard. I'm a practical man. You are, she said. You're the most practical man I've ever met. She said it like it was a virtue, because it was. You're also, she stopped, considered. You're the only man I've met in a long time that I trust. I said, "I'm glad." You should be, she said. I don't give that easy. I know you don't. She looked at the valley again. I want to get through winter first, she said. Spring seems like the right time for the rest of it. I said, "Spring it is." She leaned against me then, just slightly, her shoulder against my arm, nothing dramatic, just present. Real, her weight against me in the cold. I put my arm around her, and we stood there watching the last light leave the valley, the shapes of 20 young apple trees on the slope above the meadow, the cattle settling for the night, the creek going dark. The deed was still in my left breast pocket, or one like it. I'd had a copy made, kept the original in the tin box in the house. I carried the copy out of habit, the way you carry a thing that still feels like it might not be real. It was real, the land was real, the trees were real, the woman beside me was real. She had commanded the respect of this valley for 3 years, without asking anyone for a thing. She had held this land together alone, with nothing but her own competence and refusal to quit. And when I arrived, she had looked at me at the gate and taken me in, accurately, without sentiment, without hurry, and decided what she thought about me and proceeded accordingly. She chose to stay. She chose to trust. She chose to lean against me in the October cold and let me put my arm around her, and she said I was the only man she trusted, and she didn't give that easy. I had spent 20 years being the tool someone needed and set down again, useful but not seen. I had come to this land expecting to sell it, and instead I had found out who I was when I had something to stand on. And the woman standing beside me had been here the whole time, holding this ground, and she had seen that in me before I'd quite finished seeing it myself. That is worth something that I don't have the right word for. I still don't. Maybe that's all right. Not everything earns a word. Some things you just carry the way I carried the deed, folded close to your chest, real. The last of the light left the valley. The creek went quiet. We went inside,